In the late 1800s, a man by the name of George Walzer decided he was going to prove something to the world. He decided he was going to prove to the world that a system or government based on atheism and godlessness was far superior to any that was based on God. And so he founded a town in Missouri, named it Liberal, Missouri, and said, here is the criteria that you have to adhere to in order to be a citizen of Liberal. You cannot believe that there's any God. You cannot believe that there's any heaven. You cannot believe that there's any hell. You can't believe that there's any spiritual nature or being whatsoever. And his stated purpose was to show the world that this was going to be a better place to live than any place where people believed in God. And here was his idea. If people spend their time and resources and energy on spiritual pursuits and things not associated with the physical body, then they're wasting that time and that energy. And if they would just put all of those resources toward physical pursuits, then the society would be better, the economy would be better, the physical building and makeup of the town would be better. He just thought they're focusing their energy in the wrong place. And so he founded Liberal, Missouri. You can still go there today. I've been there. There's Walzer Avenue, named after George Walzer, the founder of Liberal, Missouri. There is Darwin Drive, named after Charles Darwin. If you were to look right there on top, you would see Paine Avenue for Thomas Paine. Ingersoll Drive, named for Robert Ingersoll, the agnostic of late. And you can see all of these road signs, and now the population is 777. Here is what happened to Liberal, Missouri. There's a man by the name of Clark Braden who went into Liberal, Missouri. As I understand it, was a member of the Lord's church. He was a traveling itinerant preacher and debater. Went in there to see what was going on. And when he did, he found exactly what you would expect to find if you know anything about what the Bible teaches is going to happen in this type of situation. He found that the hotels had become brothels, that most everybody was drunk on a regular basis. He said the kids did not obey their parents, and they cursed along with all of the adults, including all of the women and the men. He said the property value had sunk so low, people would get out if they could, but they can't, and so they're stuck there. And Liberal, Missouri is now a cesspool of immorality. And that's what he wrote in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. That is a copy of the 1885 article that Clark Braden wrote about Liberal, Missouri. Now, the people in Liberal, Missouri did not take that sitting down. One of the hotel owners decided he was going to sue Clark Braden for $25,000. And at the time, in 1885, $25,000 was a considerable sum of money. He brought charges before the judge about Clark Braden, claiming that he had committed libel and slander. The judge threw the case out. Clark Braden never had to even defend himself or appear before the court, and the man who brought the charges had to pay all of the court costs because it was so very obvious that what Clark Braden had said was true. The place was a cesspool of immorality. Now, if you've kept up with what the psalmist said at all, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable things. There is none who does good, no, not one. Well, what the psalmist is saying there is that if a person or a group of people starts with the idea of godlessness and the lack of any type of spiritual entity, you don't have a soul, there's no eternal God, there's no eternal heaven, there's no eternal hell, then that is going to stop any type of legitimate, correct decision making. And anybody who believes that, if they put that idea into practice, they are going to be corrupt, they're going to be wicked, and they are not even going to be able to come to right moral decisions. And that's what George Walzer proved to us in Liberal, Missouri. Now, you didn't need this type of social experiment to prove it, because the Bible self-evidently states it, and as you understand how things work, you could see that it's the case. But this was a case in point, a microcosm, a very clear piece of evidence that validates that truth. Now, interestingly, I have been to Liberal, Missouri, and it's laid out, the cemetery is laid out in a way I've never seen any cemetery laid out. It's laid out in a circle. And all around the circle, the graves are placed so that there is right in the middle of the circle a grave that no one is buried there now. It was intended to be for George Walser, the founder of Liberal, Missouri. But he later came in contact with the teachings of Jesus. And he realized, I've been terribly wrong. That was a tragic mistake. And I don't want to be buried in this place with the unbelievers who died and are buried here. And so he was buried in Lamar, Missouri, about 45 minutes away from Liberal, Missouri. And this is his tombstone that you can read, where he later became a philanthropist and a strong believer in the teachings of Jesus. And so Liberal, Missouri, I think, gives us a very good start if we were to discuss what happens when a society accepts the false idea that there's not a God and lives that out in their lives. What happens when individuals do that? What happens when a group of people do that? Before we do that, I'd like to ask this question. I think it's very self-evident, but we're going to stress it anyway. What happens when a group of people take the idea that there is a God, that Jesus Christ is His Son, and that the teachings of Jesus are the commandments of the Creator? What happens when a group of people decides to put those teachings into practice? Would you like to be a part of a community that is behaving like Jesus said to behave? And that's a pretty rhetorical question there, isn't it? If you understand what Jesus said, do unto others as you would have them do to you. Is that a very solid ethical and moral framework upon which to base community interactions? Certainly. What about be tender-hearted, forgiving one another, love as brothers, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than himself. Let each one of you look out not only for his own interest, but also for the interest of others. What kind of society would you have if you had everybody looking out for the other person's interest? You had everybody loving each other as brothers. You had people forgiving one another, being tender-hearted, being kind. If you had in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 that were inspired by God about love not being puffed up, love being gentle and kind and long-suffering, is that the kind of place where you'd like to live? Absolutely, positively. In fact, you can see that when those kinds of things start happening, this is a statement by, let me go to the next slide here. You'll see this is a statement by Bertrand Russell in his ideas that have helped mankind. Now, here's what's interesting about Bertrand Russell. He's not a believer at all. In fact, he at one time wrote an essay titled, Why I Am Not a Christian. Has nothing really friendly to say about Christianity whatsoever, doesn't think it's true, doesn't want to defend it in any way, but he's going to tell you what happened when Christianity as a whole started permeating the Roman society. He says Christianity, as soon as it conquered the state, put an end to the gladiatorial shows, not because they were cruel, but because they were idolatrous. The result, however, was to diminish the widespread education and cruelty by which the populace of Roman towns were degraded. Christianity also did much to soften the lot of slaves. It established charity on a large scale, inaugurated hospitals. Although the great majority of Christians failed lamentably in Christian charity, the ideal remained alive, and in every age inspired some notable saints. In a new form, it passed over modern liberalism and remains the inspiration of much that is most hopeful in our somber world. Mr. Russell, do you think you should be a Christian? No. Do you think Christianity is true? No. What happens when people act like Christians? Well, People establish hospitals and charity on a large scale, and Christianity, really the ideas behind it are the inspiration behind much that is most hopeful in our somber world. Okay, that's what happens when people behave like Christians. What happens when people behave like they don't believe in God? Well, I think Liberal showed us that, and I'm going to show you the facts that validate Psalm 14, 1 through 3. The first statement that you need to understand is that atheism's main problem as a social system or as a belief that would establish ideas socially is that atheism does not have a way to say that something is morally right or morally wrong. You see, here's the problem with atheism. It has to be driven by evolution. It has to say that there's no spiritual being whatsoever, and so you are a product of blind chance, random processes over multiplied millions of years. Supposedly, several billion years ago, there was non-living chemicals like dirt or ammonia, hydrogen, etc. They got together and somehow formed life. Now, that's biologically impossible. We won't go to the scientific evidence showing that that can't happen, but atheistically, they would have had to have gotten together, formed life, and then that life would have had to evolve into multicellular life, and then ultimately all the way up through worm, amphibian, etc., what we've talked about this weekend, and then to humans. Well, where along that path would you inject morality? Would you say that the dog stole a bone and needs to go to prison? Would you say that the chimpanzee murdered his fellow chimpanzee and needs to be sentenced to life or the death penalty? Where are you going to insert a moral standard along the natural continuum of evolution? You see, the problem is that the evolutionists themselves and the atheists admit that we can't really answer right or wrong questions. We don't have the equipment. We don't have the tools to say, no, that's wrong, that's right. This is a statement by a man named William Provine. He said, naturalistic evolution has clear consequences that Charles Darwin understood perfectly. He said, no God's worth having exists, no life after death exists. Now I want you to look at number 3. No ultimate foundation for ethics exists. Is it wrong to steal from your neighbor? He says, atheism and evolution can't answer that question. They can say, well, what will it do to the community? Would it help you evolve to a higher level? Would it mean the fitter would survive? But atheism cannot come down and say, yes, it's wrong, no, it's not. Now, that's William Provine. William Provine was from Cornell University. This is Charles Darwin's biography, autobiography actually. He says, a man who has no assured and ever-present belief in the existence of a personal God or of future retribution and reward can have for his rule of life, as far as I can tell, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are the strongest or which seem the best ones to him. Charles Darwin says, okay, if you don't believe in God, you don't believe in heaven, you don't believe in hell, how do you go about making decisions as to what's right or wrong? He said, well, whatever impulse seems strongest to you, you just follow that. Now, if you have seen what happens when people follow the impulses that often seem the strongest to them, then you've seen the truth validated by the biblical statement. There's a way that seems right to a man, but the end is the way of death or destruction. Suppose you're at Golden Corral and you go up to the guy who's serving the steak and you say, hey, I'd like a big piece of steak, I'm kind of hungry, and he cuts you one off and it's kind of small. I mean, it looks like about a 3-ouncer, and you were hoping for something bigger than that. And the person that comes up next, he says, I'll take a piece of steak, and he cuts him off a steak. It looks like it's about a 16-ouncer. And you're walking back to your chair and you see that guy's steak and you're bigger than he is, and you say, hey, I wanted a bigger steak, let me have yours. And he says, no, you can't have mine. The guy gave me this piece of steak. You say, yeah, but I'm bigger than you and I'm hungrier and I need the food more. Give me your piece of steak. And the guy says, no, I'm not giving you my steak. And you punch him in the face and take it and sit down and eat it. Have you done anything wrong according to Charles Darwin and William Provine? Was that the instinct or impulse which seemed the strongest to you at the time? Yeah. And so, what you're seeing here is the complete inability of unbelief to provide any type of framework that you could make a right or wrong decision based upon. Now, what generally speaking the atheist says is, well, we're not trying to build an ethical framework. We're not trying to do anything that would be a social community. We're just saying we don't believe in God. Well, no, that's not what you're saying. You're saying you don't believe in God, and with that stated unbelief come implications that the atheistic community who thinks through these things is going to admit, yeah, well, if you don't believe in God, that means you don't have a basis for ethical behavior, and it means really you just follow the instincts and impulses which seem the best to you. In a debate with Peter Payne, Dan Barker, the co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, made this statement. He said, there are no actions in and of themselves that are always absolutely right or wrong. It depends on the context. You cannot name an action that is always absolutely right or wrong. I can think of an exception in every case. Now let that sink in. Are there some actions that you can state categorically that they are absolutely wrong in every case? Yes. So a student comes up to the microphone after Dan Barker makes this statement, and he says, hey, I heard you say that there are no actions that are absolutely right or wrong in and of themselves. He said, would it ever be right to rape a person? Dan Barker said, well, there are some things that is so outlandish you wouldn't really run into that in normal life. But yes, I can think of a situation in which it would be your moral obligation to do that. He said, if there were aliens that came down and said we're going to kill every single person in the world unless someone did that, then it would be your moral obligation to do that. Now, I heard him say that in 2005. I'd watched this debate probably 4 times. I debated him in 2009. I said, Mr. Barker, you made this statement. You said, yes, that would be moral all right. What about 2 people? He said, yes. I said, what about 2,000? He said, yes. I said, what about 2 million? Now, here's what I thought. I guess naively. I thought if I could get one of the nation's most respected atheists in the atheistic community to say that it would be your moral responsibility to do that to 2 million people, then the people who associate with him and who claim that atheism is a superior belief, then those people would separate themselves from this guy if I could just get him to state it. In fact, I thought there's no way he's going to say that. That's the implication. That's what he really believes, but there's no way he'll say it. And he did. He said yes. And then he said, when he saw that the bulk of the people in the audience were Christians and that they were appalled at the suggestion he had just made, he realized something was not turning his direction in this debate. And he looked out at about 550 people, about 450 of them were members of the Lord's church. And then he looked at me and he said, well, you'd thank me because you'd still be alive. And I said, no, I would never thank you for that because I've got somewhere better to go after this life. You see, that's his problem. If you're making decisions missing the spiritual element of existence, then you'll always make them based on something lower than is really there. And so he's thinking, yeah, I'm just trying to preserve life, and we're knowing we're trying to preserve spiritual life. And see, that's why the Bible says that the wicked person does not understand justice. Because without the spiritual element, you can never understand what's really going on in this world. Continue with me. Let's look at this idea about abortion and atheism. The idea that you can morally have an unborn child that it would be all right to kill and to get rid of for some reason, maybe because this child is going to bleed too many resources out of your particular family or community, etc. Where would you go to get the idea that it would be all right to kill an unborn child? Now, you could not go to the Bible for that. In fact, here's what you would find if you went to the Bible to try to justify this behavior. Number 1, you would find in the book of Proverbs, chapter 6, that the Lord hates hands that shed innocent blood. And what could be more innocent than an unborn child? Nothing. Secondly, you would find that the words that the Bible uses for children are the same when it's discussing unborn children as they are when it's discussing children that are born. There's no difference in God's eyes between a child that is 3 months from being born and a child that has been born for 3 months. The words used are the exact same throughout the entire process. And what you will find is the Bible considers people from the instant of conception. When you see God talking to Isaiah, He says, "Before you were born, I knew you. When you were inside of your mother, I understood you." Talks about Him as a person before He is born from the point of conception. That's a matter of fact. There's nothing about that is even controversial. It's just the truth. So from the Bible, you're not going to get justification for killing an unborn child. It's just not there. Because God states in Genesis 9 and Genesis 1 that humans are made in the image and the likeness of God from conception. Now, where could you go and get justification, and put that in quotations, for this type of behavior? Because you understand probably that in the United States of America, every single day, we kill 2,450 unborn children. Now, you'll remember 9/11, 2001. We had terrorists. They flew planes into the Twin Towers, and that day they killed about 2,500 people. And rightly so, our president was irate, said that this type of terrorism should not go on, said that we were going to start a war on terrorism, and we're going to take it to the nations that were harboring terrorists, and we're going to bring these people to justice, and that was what should have been done. But that same day, we killed 2,500 of our own citizens, called it abortion, said it was a surgical procedure, and acted like that was okay. The day before that, we did that as well. And we've been doing that since 1973 to the tune of over 50 million babies. We have legally, and put that in quotations, legally exterminated an entire generation of United States citizens. You understand there are only about 330 million people in the United States. We've killed 50 million babies since 1973. That's about a seventh of our entire population. 1 out of 7 people we've killed in our country, and said it was all right. Now, where do you get justification for that? You don't get it from the Bible. Where can you get it? Follow along with me, please. Charles Darwin says there's no fundamental difference between man and the higher mammals in their mental faculties. He says, okay, hold on, what are we? You know, if you're buying into this atheistic idea that there is no God and that we are just elevated animals, he said, there's not really any difference. Okay, it might be that you're smarter than the person next to you, but it's not a different kind of smarts. It's just a different degree of smarts. You know, if I sit next to my wife, then one of us is much smarter than the other. And it's not me. My wife is much smarter than me, but it's not a different kind of smartness. It's just a different degree. All that means is if we took a test, I might make an 80, she might make a 95. It's not like it's some type of difference in degree, different kind. It's just a difference in degree. He says, okay, you might be smarter than a chimpanzee sitting next to you. You might be able to read something that it can't, but it's not a different kind of smarts. It's just a different degree. You just would make a 95 on the test where the chimpanzee would make a 12. That's all that there is different here. Well, if you take that idea as far as it goes, notice what Barbara Burke says. Among some animal species, infant killing appears to be a natural practice. Could it be natural for humans too, a trait inherited from our primate ancestors? Charles Darwin noted in The Sin of Man that infanticide has been probably the most important of all checks on population growth throughout human history. Now let me explain to you why I do this lesson. For this whole weekend, this is the 4th lesson in the series, we've been talking about atheism and evolution. And I think lots of times we feel like those are intellectual ideas that, okay, yeah, it's wrong, but it really doesn't have a whole lot of real life application and implication. That, yeah, okay, this person doesn't believe in God, I do, they should, but it's not really going to cause any serious problem. Just let them not believe in God. That's fine. They should, but they don't. I've tried to convince them. Okay, but here's what I want you to understand. the implications and behaviors that spring from unbelief are so devastating and destructive that you need to understand where this leads. When the two people that started, what I would say started the multiple gun shootings, school, theater, etc. They're in Columbine. One of them was wearing a shirt that said natural selector. And their first names were Dylan and Eric. And they said, Eric and I are natural selectors, and we are the fittest basically in our school. And what we're doing is eliminating those in our school that are unfit. Now, there is no getting around the fact that the Columbine shooting was done by two people who had bought into evolutionary ideas and were really putting into practice their belief that they were eliminating unfit people. And that's a fact. Now stop right here and let's see what's going to happen when you present that to the atheist. What they're going to say then is, well, hold on just a second, what about the Crusades? What about the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, where people who were calling themselves Christians were torturing people and doing terrible things to people? Hey, Christianity's got issues just like atheism does. Well, hold on just a second. Is it true that some people who call themselves Christians do not behave like Christians? And what I mean by that, are the Crusades an example of following the teachings of Christ? My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my people would fight. But it's not. And I am a king and was born to be a king, but I'm a king of a spiritual kingdom that is not engaged in physical battle anymore, is what Jesus was saying to Pilate. And he showed that to his apostles and subsequently to his early followers when Peter drew the sword in Gethsemane and he told Peter to put that sword away. All who take the sword will die by the sword. And he allowed himself to be crucified even though he could have called a legion of angels that would have saved him from that destruction. Okay, no, the Crusades were not an outcropping of the teachings of Jesus Christ. They were a perversion of the teachings of Jesus Christ. Now, here is what atheism has to admit. Okay, we might not like it, but the idea that there is no ethical foundation is the exact correct implication of unbelief. It's not a perversion of atheism. It is exactly what atheism teaches ultimately. Now, you can't do this either. Are there some people who call themselves Christians and don't act like them? Yeah, I mean, you'll have, every one of us, when we were in high school, we had people that would call themselves Christians. On Sunday, they'd be in the pews. In fact, sometimes these guys would lead prayers and do devotionals, but on Saturday night, they'd be sleeping with their girlfriends and getting drunk on a regular basis, bringing shame on the name of Jesus Christ. They call themselves Christians, but they didn't act like them. Are there people who will call themselves atheists, but not put this kind of immoral teaching into practice in their lives? Yes. Absolutely. There'll be people who will say, I don't believe in God at all, but then they will behave in a moral way. So what we're not saying is, hey, everybody who says he's a Christian or she's a Christian behaves like one, and everybody who says he's an unbeliever or she's an unbeliever acts like one. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is the beliefs, when compared, the logical implication of atheism is immorality. The fool said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable things. There is none who does good, no, not one. The logical implication of Christianity is complete moral, socially beneficent behavior. That's Christianity. Now, whether we behave like that or not is a different question. So, Barbara Burke says, hey, if we're just higher animals, the animals kill their babies. And if we're just animals, what can we do? 10% of the adult Komodo dragon's diet is baby Komodo dragon. Baby Komodo dragons can climb trees. That's the only reason that Komodo dragons are still alive today, because the adults cannot. Now she says, you look in the animal kingdom, if you're just an animal, you see how they control their population growth, and we can do the same. So basically she's saying, yes, it would be all right for us to kill our children. Now, here's what I want you to understand. So far, every statement that you've seen on that screen, it's not Kyle Butt saying this. I mean, I can stand up and say it, it's still true. But I'm trying to show you this is not me saying this. This is the leaders of the atheistic and evolutionary community themselves, Charles Darwin, William Provine, etc. Now, this guy's name is Peter Payne. Peter Payne, I saw a YouTube video with him and Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is probably recognized as the world's leading atheist. He said to Peter Payne, this man that we're about to read several quotes from, he said, Peter, I believe you are the most moral individual, ethical. He said, I believe you're the most ethical individual I have ever met. Now, you know what ethics is? Ethics is the study of doing what is right or wrong in a certain situation with the attempt to find out what's right and do it. And he was saying to Peter Payne, I believe that you're the most ethical person, that you look at situations and you do what's ethically right more than anybody else I know. Okay? Now, Peter Payne says this. He says, if we compare a severely defective human infant with a non-human animal, a dog or a pig, for example, we'll often find the non-human to have superior capacities. Only the fact that the defective infant is a member of the species Homo sapiens leads it to be treated differently from the dog or pig. Species membership alone, however, is not morally relevant. He says, you know what historically we've done? And if you were to read more of his stuff, he'd say, this is based on the idea that there's a God. He'd say, historically we've said, okay, we've got a rhesus monkey here, we've got a human here. The rhesus monkey is perfectly good and healthy, the human is defective physically or mentally. He said, and historically we've said, save the human, get rid of the rhesus monkey if we've got to choose between the two. And he said, you know why we've done that? Because this one's a human, and that's it. Because he's a member of the species humanity. Where would you get that idea? Where'd that come from? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men, that word would include all humans, all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among those are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Where do you get the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? You're endowed by your Creator with that right. Now, God explained that to us there again in Genesis 9 and Genesis 1 when He said, of all the animals you can eat, but he who sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, because in the image of God I created humans. So here's what God says. Humans are different solely because they're created in my image and they are different from every other living organism in the universe. Humans have a right to live, not because they're fast runners, thankfully, not because they're good looking, not because they're going to be valuable to society in some way as far as finding a cure for cancer or adding to the... Humans are valuable for a singular reason. They are made in the image of God. All humans. But Peter Singer says, hey, we've thought that you should just value humans because they're humans. He says that's wrong, according to atheism. Well, continue with me. What's he say? If we can put aside the obsolete and erroneous notion of the sanctity of all human life, we may start looking at human life as it really is. He says, look, let's get rid of this idea that humans are special. If atheism is true, if evolution is true, they're not special at all. They're just one more animal in the chain. Okay? So then what are you trying to say, Mr. Singer, who is an ethicist? That's what he does for a living. He's an atheistic ethicist. What are you trying to say? Well, here's what he's trying to say. You don't have to listen to me. Nevertheless, the main point is clear. Killing a disabled infant is not morally equivalent to killing a person. Very often, it's not wrong at all. Richard Dawkins, the leading atheist in the world, says Peter Singer is the most ethical person that he has ever met. Peter Singer says, you know what? If we'll just stop looking at humans like they're humans and look at them like they're animals or just part of nature, we'll be able to make better ethical decisions. Does this look like a better ethical decision to you? You see, the very second that you get rid of the idea of God, you then get rid of a foundation for moral behavior. You then also get rid of all basic human rights, because they're endowed to you by your Creator. And that's a fact. There was a young lady by the name of Leah Labresco. She was writing for the Atheistic blog. As I understand it, she had tens and tens of thousands of followers. This was probably about 5 years ago. And she wrote her last blog, and she said, I will not be writing for the Atheistic blog anymore, and here's why. She said, because it recently dawned on me that I know for a fact some things are right and some things are wrong. And so I started asking my fellow atheists, where do we get that idea that some things are right and some things are wrong? I know they are, but where do we get it if atheism is true? If there's no God, if there is no spiritual reality, who's to say what's right and wrong? Where do we get that? She said, in the atheistic community that I was asking, not any of them, not one, had an answer that was sufficient or acceptable to my question. She said, nobody could tell me. And she said, I know some things are right and I know some things are wrong, and atheism cannot answer how that's the case. And here's what she said, and I thought was so pertinent to our discussion. She said, we are like archaeologists digging up and finding moral truth. We are not like architects building our own ethical truth. She said, you can't build ethical truth, you can only find it. Well, where do you find ethical and moral truth? You find it in the nature of God. And if you don't have a God to search His nature for the ethical and moral reality, then you don't find it anywhere. Continue with me. James Rachel says, an infant with severe brain damage, even if it survives for many years, may never learn to speak. Its mental powers may never rise above a primitive level. In fact, psychologically, its capacities may be markedly inferior to those of a typical rhesus monkey. In that case, moral individualism would see no reason to prefer its life over the monkey's. Okay, now, this man was a professor, if I understand it, at the University of Alabama there in Tuscaloosa several years ago. He wrote a book titled Created from Animals, The Moral Implications of Darwinism. Now, let's look at the idea of an implication. An implication is a necessary outcropping of a belief that you are holding. So, if you know that the Pythagorean theorem says that a squared plus b squared equals c squared, c being the hypotenuse. If you have a triangle and a is 3 and b is 4, and you're not given the hypotenuse, what's the implication of those statements? A squared plus b squared equals c squared, a is 3, b is 4, c is what? It's 5. It doesn't matter if it's written down on paper for you, that is the correct and only correct right answer that's implied by the other statements. Now here's what James Rachels is saying. If we are created from animals, there are moral implications. They're not guesses. They come straight from the belief that there is no God. And what are some of those moral implications? He says this right here. Why save the human instead of the monkey? He said that's a moral implication, and he continued to say, some unfortunate humans, perhaps because they have suffered brain damage, they're not rational agents. What are we to say about them? The natural conclusion, according to the doctrine we're considering, would be that their status is that of mere animals. And perhaps we should go on to conclude that they may be used as non-human animals, or used perhaps as laboratory subjects or as food. Okay, notice that's not a statement Kyle Butt made. That's not a slanderous statement that some creationist is accusing the evolutionary community of thinking. That's a statement by one of the atheistic community's leading teachers who wrote a book titled Created from Animals, The Moral Implications of Darwinism. Continue with me. In 2006, Dr. Eric Pianka was the Texas Scientist of the Year. He went to receive his award. There are about 400 scientists, distinguished scientists there in this assembly. Before he got up, he told the cameraman not to film what he was about to say. He was a scientist who studied reptiles, and here's what his premise basically was of his talk, his premise was that humans are getting in the way of other organisms thriving. And that he was about tired of it, and that there wasn't anything better about a human than, say, a lizard or a crocodile. And so he thought that we should eliminate 90% of the human population in order to make room for other organisms in the world. And he said, when asked by one of the people who was listening to the lesson, they said, well, I mean, what do you propose? How do you propose to do that? And he said, well, something like maybe some airborne Ebola virus that would kill a person in 3 or 4 days, but then it would be gone and it wouldn't be that. The man stands up in a group of 400 scientists in Texas and says, we ought to kill 9 out of 10 people. And then has ready at his disposal the answer for how we should do it. And at the conclusion of his talk, receives a standing ovation. People report that that's what he said. Some people say, no, that's not what he really said. He really wasn't saying that. And then there is a statement by a student who was in his audience. And he says, Dr. Pianka's talk at the TAS meeting was mostly of the problems humans are causing as we rapidly proliferate around the globe. He's a radical thinker, that one. I mean, he's basically advocating for the death of all but 10% of the current population, and at the risk of sounding just as radical, I think he's right. The 2006 Scientist of the Year in the largest educational state in the country, Alaska would be larger, but it wouldn't have near the folks that Texas would, stands up and says, we should kill 9 out of 10 people. I think somebody asked him, are you going to volunteer to be in the 9 or the 1%? Or the 1? Gets a standing ovation, and the students in his audience recognize exactly what he's saying, and they say, yeah, sounds like a good idea. Is it a wonder? Is it a wonder that people go into theaters and shoot multiple individuals and victims when they're taught at school that there is no God, and ultimately the implication of that is that humans are no more valuable than bacteria? That's what Pianka said. They're no more valuable than bacteria. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They've done abominable things. There is none who does good. No, not one. Continue with me. Let me see if I've got my... Dorothea Day. Hold on just a second before you read this. We're about to be done. This is the conclusion. Dorothea Day was enamored by the teachings of a man named William Ernest Henley. Henley was a humanist. He believed that there was no God. He had suffered some real serious pain in his life. He had tuberculosis. His leg had to be amputated when he was 16, and then in a tragic freak accident, some kind of chain got wrapped around his other leg while he was standing beside a railroad car, and it drug him down the tracks quite a ways. He had serious physical pain throughout his whole life. He wrote a poem titled Invictus. Out of the night that covers me, dark as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced or cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears lies but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. You know, he's trying to say, humanism is it. I don't have to answer to whatever gods are out there because I'm in control. But as you listen, beyond this place of wrath and tears lies but the horror of the shade. You see, Henley didn't have anything to look forward to. Dorothea Day was enamored with that for quite some time until she came into the true teachings of Jesus Christ, and she wrote this response to him. Out of the light that dazzles me, bright as the sun from pole to pole, I thank the God I know to be, for Christ is conqueror of my soul. Since his the sway of circumstance, I would not wince or cry aloud under the rule which men call chance. My head with joy is humbly bowed. Beyond this place of sin and tears, that life with him and his the aid, despite the menace of the years, keeps and shall keep me unafraid. I have no fear, though strait the gate. He cleared my punishment from the scroll. Christ is the master of my fate. Christ is the captain of my soul. Friends, brothers and sisters, the ultimate foundation for morality is the love of Jesus Christ that He showed when He sacrificially and voluntarily allowed Himself to be crucified. Without an understanding of that, there's no understanding morality and justice. Thank you very much. I appreciate you being here this morning and look forward to another lesson in a little while.